Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this Stratford Festival Forum event, one of a number celebrating the 450th anniversary of the birth of William Shakespeare. This morning, or I should say, I'm Ted McGee. I'm a member of the Education and Archives Committee of the Stratford Festival Board, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to introduce Dr. Eric Rasmussen. He did his undergraduate work at Grinnell College in Grinnell, Iowa, and his graduate work in English at the University of Chicago. He's currently a professor in the English department at the University of Nevada, Reno, and the chair of the department. Besides his many scholarly contributions and his service to his department and his university, I want to emphasize that he's also a distinguished teacher, having won teaching awards at the college level, the university level, and the system-wide area. But it's his scholarship that brings us here today. There are a number of scholarly journals that every year publish an annual review of the major contributions to their particular field. For I think the last 12 years, Shakespeare Survey, one of the leading journals in that field, has invited Eric Rasmussen to do the annual review of the year's work in Shakespeare's editions and textual studies. That he's been invited to do so is a sign of the high regard with which he's held in his field of expertise. And he has earned that respect, for he has done long years and hard years working on book production in early modern England, the preparation of scholarly texts of Shakespeare's plays and his contemporaries. Let me just name a few. He has co-edited the texts of Every Man and Mankind, two medieval morality plays that exist only in manuscript. In his work, A Textual Companion to Dr. Faustus, he tackled one of the most difficult early modern play texts that we have, because there are two significantly different versions of this text. And that work led to a new edition of Marlowe's play, Dr. Faustus. He has contributed to the Cambridge University Press's monumental new edition of the works of Ben Jonson, contributed a text of the play Cynthia's Revels. And as for Shakespeare, he has published in hard copy a number of individual volumes. He has been one of the general editors of the Royal Shakespeare Company's Complete Works of Shakespeare, and he is currently the general editor of the Internet Shakespeare Editions. It's that work on Shakespeare that is the basis for this gathering. No scholar working on Shakespeare these days can ignore the First Folio, that collection of comedies and tragedies and histories that was published in 1623. For several of the plays, in fact, that volume provides the very first edition that we have. Two of the plays on this year's playbill, King John and Antony and Cleopatra, have their earliest publication there. And for Dr. Rasmussen, the First Folio has been a research subject of special interest. For a couple of decades, he and James Anthony West, and I imagine an array of graduate students, traveled the globe in search of copies of Shakespeare's First Folio. That particular search resulted in them rubbing shoulders with criminals and with wealthy eccentrics, with I was going to say possessive, but really I should say careful archivists and librarians. Even Pope Paul VI has a small part to play. Not a walk-on part, a walk-off part. He tried to walk off with one of the copies. That research has led 2 years ago to two volumes. First of all, Shakespeare's First Folio, a descriptive catalog, and secondly, the story of the process of searching for these, the Shakespeare Thefts. So would you please join me in welcoming Dr. Eric Rasmussen.
Thank you for coming out this morning. I should probably tell you the story about the Pope. The Shakespeare First Folio is one of the more valuable books in the world, as you no doubt know. Paul Allen, one of the co-founders of Microsoft, recently bought a copy for $6 million. In 1964, the Royal Shakespeare Company took their prized, they own a copy, their prized copy of the First Folio to Rome for a papal performance. It was during Vatican II. The whole College of Cardinals was there, and they were going to perform a few scenes from Romeo and Juliet. It's said to be the first time that a sitting pope has ever been to a stage play. Guys got to get out more. After their performance was concluded, they brought out their copy of the First Folio, and the Pope was supposed to bless it. But the Pope hadn't been adequately briefed, and so he accepted it as a gift. Was causing an international incident. So a few years ago, Jonathan Bate and I edited the complete works of Shakespeare for the Royal Shakespeare Company. And we're very proud of our volume, and when it came out, I gave a copy to my mother. My mother grew oddly silent. So after a few minutes, I said, "Well, Mom, what do you think?" And she said, "It's yellow." And I said, "Yeah, I know it's yellow. What do you think?" My mother said, "People will accuse you of yellow journalism." I said, "Mom, I'm not sure what that means, but I'm pretty certain people won't care about the color of the book. They'll be interested that we went back to the First Folio. We were the first editors in about 300 years to do this. People really aren't going to be concerned about the dust jacket." I owe my mother an enormous apology. Under the banner headline, "The Yellow Shakespeare," Michael Dobson wrote, "The RSC's boards, like the spine of its dust jacket, are a violent shade of mustard, liable to be as immediately noticeable in a bookshop or a scholarly library as Malvolio's stockings in Olivia's morning household." Perhaps there was one critic who was obsessed about the yellow book. We were wrong. Writing in the Daily Telegraph, A.N. Wilson said, "The new mustard-colored Shakespeare has certainly brightened my life, and not just because it is yellow. Germans publish a lot of yellow books, such as the Langenscheidt dictionaries, but these were until now the only yellow books in my room." Writing in the Times Literary Supplement, Peter Holland said, "The RSC Shakespeare is a handsome piece of bookmaking, for all that the cover design suggests the future marketing of matching curtains." The decorative potential of my book was made manifest when the home decorating magazine Real Simple featured it on its cover. Indeed, the editors of Real Simple had decided among the top 20 books that every home should own, along with The Joy of Cooking and The Ways Things Work, with the Royal Shakespeare Company's edition of Shakespeare. But this product placement was nothing. I recently saw a newspaper photograph of the novelist Philip Roth in his study, and if you can see it down there, Philip Roth has excellent taste in editions of Shakespeare. But back to the First Folio. As Ted mentioned, I was involved in a project to locate and fully catalog every copy of this book throughout the world, which started several decades ago with a really interesting man named Anthony James West. Anthony was a British businessman who had gone to Harvard to get an MBA in the 1960s and then taken American business know-how back to England when no one was thinking in Great Britain about management consulting, and he made a bundle. He became a partner of Booz Allen, the management consulting firm in New York. He ran the South American office out of Rio de Janeiro, and at some point had a midlife crisis and decided he wanted to go back to his first love, which was Shakespeare, and so he went to University College London to pursue a PhD. When he was looking around for a dissertation topic, his advisor said, well, why don't you do a census of the First Folio? No one's done this for about 100 years. It'd be a useful thing to know. And so Anthony spent the next 15 years and his entire personal fortune traveling the world, locating copies of the First Folio. He found 70 more of these copies than we previously knew existed. Now, I've never been able to decide whether this was noble or foolish. But Anthony had located copies, but basically didn't do anything more with them than that. He had always envisioned a complete catalog that would record the bindings and any annotations and the owners and the press variants and the watermarks and basically everything about each individual folio. And so I teamed up with him and, as Ted mentioned, a team of graduate student research assistants, and we traveled the globe visiting these things, working with owners, working with librarians, and putting together the complete description of every known First Folio. And along the way, we found all sorts of wonderful things, not just stories, but the uniqueness of individual copies. And today I wanted to talk about some of the things that we found. Now, you may have heard the Toronto copy of the First Folio is visiting Stratford for this weekend. Go off and see it if you can. I saw on the news that it enjoyed a police escort on its way here. And I just wanted to share with you that not all owners are quite this careful with their First Folio. So the Marquis of Bath, in his copy, looks like cat prints to me. And you know, if you had some household accounts in which to settle, there's some blank space at the end of the Taming of the Shrew. And surely, if your child is learning ABCs, nothing better than Henry IV, Part 1. This one I think is really sweet. And the Two Gentlemen of Reno, someone has written, Anne Park is. And Anne Park is not the Two Gentlemen of Reno, but look at the line underneath it. Anne Park is that I did love, for now my love is thawed. I think it's really kind of tender that Anne Park was someone he or she had loved before. This is a really fascinating one. This copy, the Dr. Williams copy, was held by a minister, and it was in his library and for 300 years. It just sold recently. And there's a interesting marginal annotation here, and I'll take you through it. But I desire the reader's mouth to kiss the writer's arse. Sometimes we found annotations that are not quite so frivolous and profoundly interesting. This is a copy that is in Scotland at the University of Glasgow Library, and under the names of the principal actors, the person has written under Robert Benfield, "No, I know him." This is an exact contemporary who knew some of the actors, presumably had seen them perform. So both Robert Benfield and I think Joseph Taylor, he says that he knows. John Lowen says, by eyewitness, meaning I don't know him personally, but I've seen him, or I know someone who has seen him. Under William Osler, hearsay. I've heard about him. And then under Richard Burbage by report. Heard about him too. And then William Shakespeare, quite fascinating, less for the making, or less for making. Maybe he doesn't act as much because he's the one who makes the plays. So I have less opportunity to see him, to know him. But so this individual who was an eyewitness to Shakespeare's company in performance has left some reviews of the two Jennifer Ramona. He says, stark naught, absolutely worthless. On the Merry Wives of Windsor, he comments upon Ford's concerns about his wife's fidelity, that this is a good jealous man's dilemma. And then at the end of the Merry Wives of Windsor, he comments, very good, light. Another really interestingly annotated copy is in Meisei Library in Japan. In the 1970s and 80s, when the yen was at its zenith, the Japanese were acquiring every copy of the Shakespeare First Folio that came on the market. There are now 12 copies in Meisei University alone. This one is particularly fascinating because it says William Johnstone, his book. And we know a William Johnstone who was a Scotsman who flourished during the 1630s and 1640s. So it was probably a contempt. He probably bought the Shakespeare Folio when it was printed in the 1620s. Someone has written next to Ben Jonson's poem to the memory of my beloved, the author William Shakespeare, someone has written to the memory of my uncle, the author. So that this is the Johnstone family, that they're implying here that the uncle of at least whoever wrote this annotation was Ben Jonson. So there's a link between this family and Shakespeare's friend and colleague, Ben Jonson, which is pretty fascinating. This person annotated this First Folio within inches of its life. Every margin is filled with his annotations, and you can see his process of reading is to presumably tick the line after he's finished reading it and underline it. So as he worked his way through this entire book, he's annotating and ticking and underlining, and the pages are just filled. He gets a little tired by the time he gets to the tragedies. You can see that he's simply underlining the first words, and then by Othello, it's you can't be bothered anymore. What's really fascinating is what interests. I assume it's William Johnstone, but we don't necessarily know. But for the Comedy of Errors, for instance, he comments on the wonderful intricacy of mistakings. He loves the instances of mistaken identity in that play as the two sets of twins are mistaken for each other. And then, quite wonderfully, he goes through and, well, anytime there's a mistaken identity, he'll say, mistaking, 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 mistaking. And you wonder, on a more serious note, what the annotations were for. It was a way as he read to synthesize the experience, to comment upon it. Was he leaving the comments for another reader as they came? Sometimes Johnstone is not the most trenchant of reviewers. At the end of Measure for Measure, when you have that deeply problematic ending where Isabel, who at the beginning of the play was about to become a nun, out of nowhere, the Duke says, "And you'll marry me." And she sort of looks up at him and doesn't have a line for the rest of the play. Lucio is punished by being forced to marry a prostitute. It's a very dark, problematic ending. William Johnstone has written a pleasant conclusion of the adventures. Knowing that the Johnstone First Folio was so heavily annotated, I was interested when a painting came on the market owned by the Johnston family, said traditionally by the family to be of William Shakespeare. This was at one of those auctions of family paintings in England that occurs fairly frequently, and are largely ignored. They're just ancestors, members of the family, that the family itself has either died out or no one wants anymore, so they go up for sale. And included in this was this portrait of Shakespeare. It didn't cost very much money, and so I bought it. And for me, when you're looking at the First Folio, the First Folio was printed 7 years, 1623, 7 years after Shakespeare's death. So the dropout engraving here could not have been done from life. It probably had to have been a likeness of Shakespeare, which we've never found. Of all the purported portraits of Shakespeare, he's always looking the other way. So my portrait was the only one that, and again, if you're going to make an engraving, it's going to be the mirror image of the picture you're working from. And the rough, and oh my, Jonathan Bate and I are quite rational individuals for the most part, but we look in those eyes and say, that's how we want him to look. There's an intelligence in those eyes. And so we got very excited about this painting. CBS News found out about it, and we're going to send a film crew over. And I talked to some people in the National Portrait Gallery in London, and they authenticated it, that it was painted by a British artist in 1610, so about the right time. And the paint was could be dated pretty much to that era. And so we had them do a cleaning. Unfortunately, when they cleaned the picture, they realized that it had been overpainted, and that it originally looked like this. What clearly had happened was that someone had taken this portrait of a nobleman, and probably as early as 1700, the paint used in the overpainting was Prussian blue that wasn't used until that period. So maybe within 100 years, someone had painted it over to look more like Shakespeare. About the time that we discovered this, the CBS News crew showed up. Now, I had been told that it was going to be CBS Sunday Morning, the casual, cultural news magazine format. I was expecting Bill Geist or maybe the avuncular Charles Kuralt. Instead, Richard Roth showed up. Richard Roth, as you may know, is a hard-hitting investigative reporter. You may remember that he was led away by the students in Tiananmen Square, caused quite a stir. So I am a little bit unsettled by this, but I go into my story about the Johnstones and the Annotated Folio and how this family that was so interested in Shakespeare may possibly related to Ben Jonson might well have owned a portrait of Shakespeare. And that wasn't it interesting that someone had made it look more like Shakespeare? And Richard Roth says, Eric, bad television. And I said, what do you want me to... I want to know how it felt when you thought you had a portrait of Shakespeare. I don't know. What do you want me to say? That I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. And then, how did it feel when you found out it was a forgery? And Richard Roth, who is bald, said something to the effect of, and so they painted him bald to make him look more intelligent. And I said something stupid like, oh yeah, with the brains sprouting out. It turns out this was not for CBS Sunday Morning. This was for the evening news, which opened that night with me saying, I couldn't eat, I couldn't sleep. And the narrative arc was Shakespeare scholar buys painting thinking it's Shakespeare, and spends hundreds proving that it's not. Profoundly embarrassing. But the quest to make things look like Shakespeare takes us to a really interesting fellow in the 19th century, when rich owners of First Folios were missing some of the original pages. This is an age before photolithography and so forth. They would commission a man named John Harris to make a pen and ink facsimile. So often the pages were the final pages of Cymbeline, the last play in the volume. Especially if the book was unbound, those are the ones who would be most in danger of being lost. So here's that page of Cymbeline. On the left is the original page. On the right is John Harris's pen and ink facsimile. I mean, the meticulous work that goes into this, it's just incredible. And if you look carefully, it's really hard to distinguish the original from the copy, except for right down here. Notice under the catchword, there's a little smudge, which I'll blow up for you. He was so proud of his work that he would sign it. Often, I've discovered that owners didn't know that they had a page that was a John Harris facsimile, and they're disappointed that it's not an original. And I just say to them, you have a thing of beauty here. I mean, this is a work of art. I love discovering Harris pages because they're just so expertly done. Another work of art, the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, D.C. As you may know, Henry Clay Folger had a mania for collecting First Folios, and so collected 82 of them now, depending how you count, are in the Folger. A couple years ago, this individual, named Raymond Scott, came into the Folger Shakespeare Library with a copy of the First Folio, which had the covers ripped off, the title pages ripped out, and he claimed that he had acquired it from one of Fidel Castro's bodyguards. The Folger suspected that it might be a copy that had been stolen from the University of Durham Library in Northeast England. Whoever had done so had assumed that if you tear off the covers that might have identifying shelf marks, and if you tear off the title page that might have an identifying mark, that it couldn't be traced. It also turned out that Raymond Scott lives 7 miles from Durham University. They came to Anthony James West and said, is there a way that we can identify this as the Durham Cathedral copy? And Anthony said yes. In the text of Troilus and Cressida, there is a wedge-shaped piece that had been cut out at some point in the book's history. No one knows why, but it's a very distinct, going through several pages. And so with that wedge-shaped cut, we had Raymond Scott dead to life, and he was convicted and is serving a 7-year jail sentence for theft, and he's the longest penalty that's ever been meted out for a stolen book. Raymond Scott died in his jail cell. Just sad. But brings us to a really interesting question. Is the First Folio cursed? One of my research assistants was tasked with the job of locating the birth and death dates for every owner of every First Folio. And you may think that this just sounds like harmless drudge work, right? And she's just, because some of these folios have gone through a dozen different owners over time. And so she's dutifully working at this, and she looks up at me at one point and says, have you ever noticed that most people who buy a First Folio die shortly thereafter? I said, no, I don't think that can be true at all. And she said, well, look, James Boswell, the younger, the son of Dr. Johnson's biographer, purchased the First Folio that had belonged to the celebrated actor John Philip Kendall in January of 1821. On February 4th of 1822, Boswell died in his chamber. His folio then passed to his only brother, Alexander Boswell. Alexander Boswell was killed in a duel 20 days later. In 1829, Sir Frederick Francis Baker acquired the First Folio that had belonged to the celebrated sculptress Anne Dammer. On October 1st, 1830, Baker was explaining the workings of a windmill to his children, but apparently being very nearsighted, he got too close to one of the blades, was struck on the head, and killed. In 1853, 25-year-old William George Sutton inherited a First Folio from his father and then died himself in the following year. On July 26th of 1887, the London book dealer Henry Southern purchased a First Folio at Sotheby's and subsequently sold it to Sir George Byrne. Byrne, however, was dead within months, and his library sold at auction in 1887. The list continues. Dean Sage, one of Mark Twain's close friends, purchased a First Folio on April 9th, 1902. 2 months later, Sage died of a heart attack at age 61. Harry Widener purchased the First Folio in 1910. In April of 1912, returning from a book-buying trip in London, Widener and his parents boarded a ship. The ill-fated Titanic. Harry apparently lost his chance at a seat in a lifeboat when he returned to his cabin to retrieve his copy of Francis Bacon's 1598 essays. His last words were said to have been, as he called to his mother, "I've placed the volume in my pocket. The little Bacon goes with me." Eleanor Elkins Widener ultimately was rescued. The bodies of the male Wideners were never recovered. In memory of her son, Eleanor underwrote construction of the Harry Widener Memorial Library at Harvard University, to which she donated his rare book collection, including the First Folio and the Gutenberg Bible that his grandfather had purchased to surprise the young man when he returned from the transatlantic crossing. Very sad. Upon the death of Sir Thomas Edward Watson in 1921, his First Folio passed to his 46-year-old son, Sir Wilfrid Watson, who died in the following year. Arthur Spencer Dayton purchased the First Folio at auction in November of 1946, but was dead by 1948 at the age of 61. William Phillips, in late November of 1949, purchased all 4 Shakespeare Folios, which he got to enjoy for just over a year before he died in December of 1950 at the age of 68. Sir Paul Getty bought a First Folio in 2000 and was dead by 2003. What do you think? If you go visit the First Folio, just stay back. So, as Ted mentioned, I wrote up a little book of stories about the First Folio, and so I was looking at some of the other books that Shakespeare scholars had written that were meant for a more general audience, and I noticed this incredible pattern See if you can see it. Germaine Greer's Shakespeare's Wife, Jim Shapiro's Contested Will, Marge Garber's Shakespeare After All. What do you notice? No heads. What's going on here? I insisted that there be a head on my book jacket. And I really admire Lorenzo Lotto's oil painting from the Renaissance, a portrait of a gentleman in his study. I mean, it has a nice large folio. There's a little bit of a look of an intrigue. It's got a lizard. And so the designers at my publisher scoped out a copy. I thought that was nice. I wasn't quite happy with the subtitle, Stealing the World's Most Famous Book. I think there are perhaps one or two books that are more famous than the Shakespeare Folio, but we won't go there. A month before publication, Yale University Press brings out the book in the Renaissance and stealing my thunder and my cover. But the long-suffering designers came up with this, and I don't know. This isn't a first folio; it's a fourth folio. I know I'm probably the only one who would know that, but it would bother me, and so they were very generous and ultimately came out with this cover, which we're all happy with. Although I'm certain my mother will observe. That it's yellow. Thank you all.
Thanks very much, Eric. We have some time for questions. Our format is that I will try to hear your question, capture the gist of it, and repeat it. And I'm relieved to say Eric will answer. Who'd like to begin? Yes, please.
You mentioned that there were 82 copies at Folger, but then you said depending on how you count. So can you explain a bit about the counting difficulties?
It's tricky, isn't it?
Let's see. Did everybody hear that?
Yeah.
Yes, great.
Imagine you owned a page of a First Folio. Do you own a First Folio? No. How about if you had a play? You had a whole text of Hamlet. Is that a First Folio? Well, no. First Folio is 36 plays. But imagine you own 20. Is that a First Folio? So it's the question of how much of a fragment do you need when it becomes the book? If you own, and go from the other end, if you own a First Folio that's missing one page, is that still a First Folio? Sure. How about if it's missing 10, 20, 100, 500? And so that's the question. And so the Folger for a long time insisted they owned 79. And Anthony and I insisted that because they had 3 fragments that were more than 50%, which is what we were counting as our cutoff, that they actually owned 82. And it was somewhat of a victory that the Folger now acknowledges that they have 82 in their best interest.
Yeah.
Can you repeat the questions even if the people here?
All right.
Because we're live streaming.
Oh, yes.
Everybody, we
Thank-
have to repeat the questions. Excuse us, but
Thanks, Pat. We're live streaming, and so I have to repeat all the questions. Yes, right at the top. The question is, do you believe that there are lost works out there that were not included in the First Folio?
Sure. One of the things that's interesting is that the two actors, Hemmings and Condell, Shakespeare's fellow actors who put together the First Folio after his death, appear to have deliberately left out plays that were collaborations. And so we know plays like Pericles and The Two Noble Kinsmen are not included in the First Folio, and they had texts of these. And indeed, when the Second Folio was published, the same printers brought out quartos of Pericles and The Two Noble Kinsmen. I'll bet anything they were bundling it. In the days before shrink wrap, here you have your first folio, and here are the bonuses. We know that there was a play called Cardenio that he collaborated on with John Fletcher, also omitted from the First Folio. We know that Shakespeare collaborated at the beginning of his career and at the end of his career, which I like to think of as Shakespeare, the apprentice dramatist, writing some scenes with established playwrights in order to get his feet wet in the profession and come up to speed. And then when he does, he writes single-authored plays for the majority of his career, and then at the conclusion, he's passing the baton to John Fletcher, who's going to take over as chief dramatist for the King's Men, and so he collaborates with Fletcher on plays like Henry VIII and The Two Noble Kinsmen and Cardenio. And so we have texts of most of these plays. Cardenio is lost, but interestingly, in the 18th century, a Shakespeare editor named Louis Theobald claimed that he had discovered a lost Shakespearean manuscript. And he says, I have now adapted this for the stage, and he published it. It's called Double Falsehood. Double Falsehood is based on an episode from Cervantes' Don Quixote. Cervantes, by the way, died on the same day that Shakespeare did. Theobald, interestingly, could not have known of a record, an early record of that Fletcher and Shakespeare had collaborated on this play called Cardenio. Cardenio is also a character from Don Quixote. So it's an interesting coincidence that we have a record of a play that's lost, and Louis Theobald in the 18th century claimed that he had found one. Now, the play that he produced was heavily, heavily adapted. This is what they did in the 18th century. They took Shakespeare, and as you may know, they adapted the life out of him. Nahum Tate gave King Lear a happy ending. Lear saves Cordelia, Cordelia marries Edgar, Lear and Gloucester go off to contemplate philosophy. It's very nice. So if Theobald had a manuscript, he really adapted it to within inches of its life. And the metaphor I like to use is that of a dinosaur skeleton. You know, sometimes in a museum you'll see a dinosaur skeleton. It'll be mainly fiberglass, but occasionally there's an original femur. Right? I think that's when in Double Falsehood it's mainly Louis Theobald and maybe a little bit of Shakespeare in there. So actually, as a companion volume to our complete works for the Royal Shakespeare Company, Jonathan Bate and I just brought out a volume of the collaborative plays. And these are plays that Shakespeare participated in, probably wrote a couple of scenes for. There's good evidence. And what's really fascinating is it gives us a picture of Shakespeare as a working man of the theater, not someone who was off in an ivory tower, but someone who was down there in the trenches. There's a manuscript called Sir Thomas More, where Shakespeare was brought in as a play doctor. 6 playwrights came in to sort of fix up an old play that needed major revisions. And when Shakespeare is writing on his scene for that play, he apparently doesn't know the names of the other characters in the play. He knows that Sir Thomas More has a big speech, but for every other character for the speech heading, he just writes other. And it's fascinating to see. The other thing that I love is that on some of the early plays, he writes parts for very strong female characters. And it's so interesting that at the beginning of his career, Shakespeare is writing strong female characters. You think of Queen Margaret in the Henry VI plays, and Richard III for that matter. I love the idea that Shakespeare is the go-to guy when you need a strong female character. And that it so looks forward to Cleopatra and Lady Macbeth and Portia and so forth later in his career. So it's a really interesting group of plays. So there are those plays. Do I think we're going to find a long lost one in someone's attic? Who knows? We seem to hear about this a lot, don't we? The New York Times is fond of putting a front page story. Recently, someone claimed to find a book that Shakespeare owned and had annotated. And who knows?
Yes, right here.
Do we know how many was the first run of the First Folio, and how many do we know still exist?
The question is, How many copies were published in the first publication of the First Folio, and how many copies are surviving today?
The First Folio took about 2 years to print, enormous undertaking. And we know that the Stationers Register, the company of stationers, limited the number of copies of any book that could be printed to about 1,000. They wanted to keep pressmen and compositors in work. So the idea is if you had a popular book, you could print 1,000 copies, but then you had to completely reset the type and do it again. So we know it could be no more than 1,000. It was probably closer to 750. This was an enormously expensive book. This book cost £1. And this is in a period of history where a skilled laborer, like a weaver or a bricklayer, would earn £4 a year. So this was 3 months' salary to buy this book. It has been, the purview of the very rich from the beginning on forward. So we're thinking 750. We have located 232. And that's a massively good survival rate. A lot of the smaller quartos didn't do very well. The first quarto of Hamlet survived only 2 copies, and one doesn't have the title page and one doesn't have the final page. The first quarto of Titus Andronicus is only in 1 copy. So the smaller paperbacks seem to have had, this is a big book. And we know one was lost in the Chicago fire. We know one was lost when an Arctic steamliner went down, and we have others that were similarly burned and things. But 232 is a pretty good survival rate if we actually have a third of these.
Yes, right here.
Why is your book called The Shakespeare Thefts? What thefts?
The question is, why is the book called The Shakespeare Thefts? What thefts are involved?
Throughout its history, the Shakespeare Folio has been stolen. And there are some really interesting records of early thefts. The Spanish ambassador to London may have had his book censored by the Inquisition when he took it back to Spain, and it apparently disappeared in the mid-19th century. So there are all sorts of missing copies floating around out there. One of the most fascinating ones for me is that many years ago, I approached a Japanese family outside of Tokyo who owns a First Folio. And they were very polite and said, well, we're sorry, but according to the terms of my husband's will, no one can examine the First Folio until 13 years after his death. Well, that's a little odd. But after 13 years, we returned. Nothing if not tenacious. And they wanted absolutely nothing to do with us. And we know that the book has a bright red stain on all of its corners. And so it's possible, and I don't, without examining it, I can't do anything but hypothesize, but there was a copy stolen from the Manchester University Library in England in the late 1960s, early 1970s. So that may have made its way to Japan, and they may know that that could be a stolen copy. So it's stories along those lines that I was interested in telling about throughout history.
Yes, please.
Were all of the First Folios bound the same? Do they look identical, or were they changed up over the course of the publishing and printing process?
This question is, were all of the First Folios bound in the same way so that they have the same physical appearance?
None of the folios coming out from the publishers would have been bound. Every individual owner would have bought it unbound and then had their own binding done. So often, there's no uniform binding. Sometimes you can find them in the original calfskin. That's somewhat unusual. There's a marvelous copy that was the deposit copy at the Bodleian Library in Oxford in 17th century England, every book, just as today, every book that's published, you have to send a copy to the Library of Congress. In 17th century England, the depository library was the Bodleian, so every copy had, so this was the copy that the publishers sent to Oxford, to Oxford University, and they chained it to a desk. And it's actually very, very sweet because clearly the well-thumbed pages are Romeo and Juliet. So the Oxford undergrads, story of young love. At some point, this copy was stolen, and it was about 150 years until it was recovered. And there's a gash in the binding where they ripped it off the chain. Private owners often want to gussy up their copies in rich leathers and gilt tooling and things. And this is kind of the bane of my existence. Because when they rebind a copy, they trim it. And when they trim it, they shave off what could be important marginalia. And so the loss involved when they're thinking they're enhancing the value of their books by doing this, but in fact they're decreasing it. So there are individual binders which are interesting of the 18th century and 19th century, but yeah, they're all over the place.
Yes, question here.
Was the folio an instant hit? Was it a bestseller?
Was
And if not, when did it start to be realized as something valuable and people started collecting?
Was the folio an instant hit, a bestseller in its own time? And if not, when did it become such a expensive book?
It started off being an expensive book. What's interesting is the folio is a watershed. Never before was a folio, folios were this very big, expensive, imposing style of printing, usually used for works of theology and philosophy and history and Bibles. Never before was a folio devoted exclusively to plays. Ben Jonson had published some plays in his folio of 1616, but people made fun of him. He called his folio works, and people made a joke that, oh, you don't know the difference between works and plays. So the publication of the folio was a dramatic leap forward is really the beginning of what we think of as dramatic literature. And it would be very much as if someone were to collect the television scripts for, I don't know, Everybody Loves Raymond, bind them in leather, and call them dramatic works. Every one of us would say, oh, that's not literature, popular entertainment. Well, at this time, plays were popular entertainment. So binding them in volumes was a completely new thing. The Puritans hated it. There's one Puritan writer who complains that Shakespeare's plays are printed on better paper than Bibles. But the reading public seems to have eaten it up. And we know this because literally, it took 2 years of more or less solid printing time in order to produce the First Folio. It was republished within a decade. So in 1632, the second folio comes out. And again, that had to take 2 years to print, so they had to start that in 7, 8 years after the First Folio had been printed. And that's a remarkable turnaround rate. And then a third folio was printed in 1664, and then a fourth folio in 1685. So the fact that printers and publishers were willing to go to the considerable expense of bringing these out suggested they were, in fact, bestsellers.
Question up here.
Yes, I believe you said that there were 36 plays in the First Folio, and to my recollection, Shakespeare has been credited with 37 plays. If so, which one was missing, and when was it added?
The question is, which plays were included in the First Folio, which plays were not included in the First Folio, and when were they added?
As I mentioned, the publishers apparently deliberately left out Pericles and the Two Noble Kinsmen probably because they were both collaborative works that Shakespeare had a share in, but that he shared the writing with somebody else. So those are the two plays that are standardly included in complete works. As we've been doing more work, especially with computer analysis of style, we can look at other anonymous plays from the period and identify pretty certainly that, oh, Shakespeare wrote those scenes between the Countess of Salisbury and King Edward in the play called Edward III. Well, the question is, does that then belong in the complete works? Now, some publishers, they just want what's known as a unique selling point, right? So this makes our edition more complete than somebody else's edition. So they put in Edward III. In the play known as Sir Thomas More that exists only in manuscript, Shakespeare, we know, wrote a scene and maybe a couple of other speeches. Does Sir Thomas More deserve to be in the whole play, or just that Shakespearean scene? And it's a really interesting question. The science of stylometry is just growing by leaps and bounds. As you may know, this establishes an authorial fingerprint, and that every author has a certain set of words and phrases that they use with a certain degree of regularity, and so you can identify authors by use of sort of computer analysis of these stylistic fingerprints. And my favorite story, some of you who were at the talk yesterday will have heard, is that a man named Don Foster developed one of these programs for identifying authorship, and as his PhD thesis, and he sent his book manuscript to Harvard University Press. Harvard University Press sent it out to an anonymous reader, and the anonymous reader reported, garbage. You can't identify authors just based on internal evidence. And he rejected the book. Don Foster took the rejection letter, ran it through his authorship program, figured out who the anonymous reviewer was, wrote to him and said, I think you can. Don, you may remember several years ago there was a novel published anonymously called Primary Colors. It was about the Clinton campaign. Don took Primary Colors, ran it through his authorship machine, figured out that it was Joe Klein who had written it, and Joe Klein had to admit that, yes, indeed, he had. And one of the things the authorship program does is it looks for collocations, words that are used together by certain authors and sometimes uniquely. And in this case, the only author who had ever used the phrase tarmac hopping to talk about candidates on the campaign trail was Joe Klein.
There's several hands up here. I'm going to start on the left. Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you. I have an 1832 Edinburgh plays of Shakespeare copy that has a plate in it called The Views of the Jubilee Procession, 1769, the 1769. Since we're in Stratford here on our A1, it was in Stratford upon A1. Do you have any research on that, or have you studied that?
This is a question about a 19th century copy of a work in which there is an engraving of, what is it?
Jubilee Procession.
The Jubilee Procession.
1769.
1769, thank you.
It was 1764, and this was to celebrate the 200th anniversary of Shakespeare's birth. And it was in this part of the 18th century, Shakespeare was just all the rage. Everyone who was anyone was editing Shakespeare. Alexander Pope, the great poet, was editing Shakespeare. Nicholas Rowe, the dramatist, was editing Shakespeare. William Warburton, who was Speaker of the House of Parliament. Henry Staunton, the guy who invented chess pieces, was editing Shakespeare. And so they threw a huge party in Stratford-upon-Avon to celebrate. And this was really the beginning of Stratford as a mecca for Shakespeare fans, and this was the first big gathering of those.
Yes, please, in the middle, yes.
Without the First Folio, would we even know who Shakespeare is?
Question is, without the First Folio, would we know who Shakespeare is today?
Probably. It would be interestingly skewed, because exactly half of Shakespeare's plays were published during his lifetime in quarto form, and some were wildly popular. But the wild popularity in his lifetime is very different than his popularity now. Guess what Shakespeare's bestseller was?
We have a guess of Romeo and Juliet? Titus Andronicus? Midsummer Night's Dream? Henry VI? Eric.
Henry IV, Part 1, went through 6 or 7 editions before the publication of the First Folio. You know how many editions of Macbeth went through? 0. Julius Caesar, 0. The Tempest, 0. Many, many plays, Twelfth Night, we only have because we've got the First Folio. So the fact that Shakespeare was published in folio, as I mentioned, was a watershed moment in literary history. It was really the creation of what we think of as dramatic literature. So either clearly his fellow actors knew that he had something, and that ought to be preserved in this way. And yes, if we didn't have the folio, we wouldn't have half of the plays. I think also if we didn't have the folio, he wouldn't be the established author that he's become.
Yes, the woman in blue here.
So where was the most interesting and/or dangerous place that you found a new folio?
The question is, what was the most interesting and dangerous place where you found a new copy of the folio?
Well, there has been some talk that that missing Japanese copy, the Yakuza, could be involved. This is the Japanese mafia who heavily tattooed. They slice off their fingers to show how tough they were. I had mentioned this in passing to my publisher, who then sprayed it on all the advertisements that Rasmussen has, back alley encounters with heavily tattooed thugs in Tokyo. Not quite what I said, but I think for genuine danger, in Meisei Library in Japan, they have an underground bank vault in which they keep their holdings, and along with the Shakespeare First Folios, they have all of Madame Curie's notebooks. I will bet anything that those things are radioactive.
There's a question up here.
So along those same lines, of the ones that you've located, how many have you not been able to see? And how many do you suspect are currently in the hands, are stolen?
The question is, how many copies of the First Folio have you not been able to see, and how many do you suspect are stolen?
We have seen all except this copy in Japan, so we've seen 231. We know of 14 for which there are records, and we haven't been able to find those copies. And we've tried really hard. There is a copy in India that we suspect is a facsimile, but it's in a fairly remote region that they don't have the technology to really give us digital scans and things that we want. I mean, the interesting thing about the Shakespeare Folio facsimiles is that as soon as photography was invented in the 19th century, the first facsimile book that was produced was a facsimile of the First Folio. And they were so pleased by how exact they could make it, they have nothing in there to identify that it's a facsimile. And so many owners of these early facsimiles, rightly, or it's not their fault, but they assume that they have an original. And it's very easy to tell that they don't. So there may be one in India, but we have little leads that vanish. Thomas Hardy, when the last census of First Folios was completed in 1901, Thomas Hardy wrote to Sir Sidney Lee, who had compiled it, and said, "Oh, you missed one. My neighbor here in Dorset's got it." And so Thomas Hardy, so Sir Sidney Lee dutifully went out to Dorset, but couldn't find hide nor hair of the neighbor or the copy. So.
Sir.
Copies that you found of the First Folio, are you able to get digital scans of all of them so that you can do comparisons and do the analysis that you normally do?
The question is, all of the copies that they've been able to see, has also been possible to get digital scans of them so that you can do analysis and collation of the texts.
We collated them all in situ just because the intellectual property rights of each unique copy lie with that particular owner. And the owners have been are very protective for the most part. There are about 11 fully scanned digital copies currently available on the internet. For a long time, the Folger was really playing things close to the chest and not making digital scans available, but they've just started to do so. If we found something of interest, like dirty cat paw prints, we would ask the owner if they would let us take a digital photograph, and without flash and without harming it and things like that. But yeah, no, we did all our collations with the physical books.
Yes, please.
I hate to put you on the spot with a local audience, but how would you analyze the Toronto copy of the First Folio as folios go?
The question is, how would you analyze the University of Toronto copy of the First Folio in the light of your knowledge of others?
Toronto copy, as I recall, is a pretty standard copy. It's missing a handful of pages. Not missing any pages at all?
It's got the Harris title page.
Correct.
Other than that, it's complete.
Okay.
The comment is that it has...
That is one critical, and the title page is frequently the one that's been missing or inserted from other copies, which always bugs me. I mean, if you've got a folio that's more or less complete, but it's missing the title page, how do you find another title page? Right? I mean, who says, "Oh, you can have mine"? And this is there was a time when Sotheby's had in the basement had a pile of 200 to 300 separate pages of original First Folio pages that they would then sell to wealthy collectors to complete their copies. My favorite story is there is a collector eccentric individual. My understanding is that he lived primarily on food from McDonald's, but he owned a First Folio. And his First Folio had been chewed on, probably by rats, and the corners had been chewed. And so he, in order to make his folio complete, he purchased those leaves, original leaves that had been, were the ones that had been chewed, and instead of replacing them, he cut off the corners of the originals and then pasted them on using Japanese paper. So he had original, and so somewhere there are a bunch of pages with the corners cut off.
Yes, please.
With all your in-depth knowledge at this point in the stage of your life, is there any doubt in your mind that Shakespeare is Shakespeare?
The question is there any doubt in Eric's mind that Shakespeare is Shakespeare?
None. I mean, when you spend a lot of time in archives and with records and things, and you see that Shakespeare has just sort of lived the normal existence of a playwright. He shows up in the cast lists of Ben Jonson plays. He signs. Is a sharer of the company, and he signs mortgage deeds and things like this. And there's something about all the theories that Shakespeare had to be. He couldn't be this uneducated son of a Glover from Stratford. It had to be someone who had traveled. It had to be someone who had gone to university. That's genuinely elitist. And it's a lot like saying the author of Harry Potter could not have been a welfare mom. Right? Because no, it could. It is. But for my part, I really don't care who the person was. I care about the work that we have left, and I find it very frustrating that the attention on the authorship issues deflect attention from the work. I recently taught a workshop for 5-year-olds, and these were 5-year-olds who were identified as geniuses. And I hadn't thought very much about how I was going to teach this class. And I thought, well, 5, boy, can they read? I guess they can read. Do they read Shakespeare? I guess they read Shakespeare. What am I going to do? And I thought, well, maybe I'll bring in a list of unique Shakespearean words and phrases, and like in a pickle, was never used before Shakespeare, and that we could do a short story or write a poem, see who could use the most phrases. And so I get into this class, and this little 5-year-old boy stands up and says, "I'm sorry, but wasn't Shakespeare really Sir Francis Bacon?" And this little girl stands up and says, "Oh, if you'd ever read any Francis Bacon, you would never say such a thing." She said, "Shakespeare is nothing if not nuance. Sir Francis Bacon wouldn't recognize a nuance if it bit him on the nose." And I'm going, I brought some coloring books.
Yes, Jules.
What do you think of the publication of a single page from the first edition of Webster's Dictionary combined with a single page from the First Folio?
Question is, what do you think of the publication of the first page of Webster's Dictionary and the first page of Shakespeare's First Folio?
I'm not sure I understand the question. You mean a book in which it has a leaf from both included?
The same, each comes from a first edition.
Each comes from a first edition.
That first edition of Webster's Dictionary and the first edition, and a sheet from the Folio.
A sheet from the First Folio. Yeah, this is the editions, especially during the early 20th century. People when they had a broken up copy of, let us say, Webster's Dictionary or a Shakespeare Folio, they would put out an edition, and which, along with the book, which is usually Shakespeare's complete work, you would get a page inserted. They even did this with manuscripts. There are manuscript editions of Thoreau and Emerson in which someone had a manuscript of Thoreau's journal and put in page. So you can imagine the nightmare for scholars who are trying to edit those journals and going back. And again, it's nice to have a souvenir. I myself own a page of the First Folio, but it also means that they were broken up. We'd like to think that they were already broken up, but it's possible that they could have been deliberately broken up in order to make some money. I just was corresponding with a scholar at Stanford who has just acquired a lovely illuminated manuscript leaf for her university, only to find out to her horror that the individual she had bought it from had the complete book of hours of 300 pages and had been slicing them up and selling them to very knowledgeable institutions. So there's something, I mean, I understand the collecting instinct, and surely with Shakespeare, the mania for collecting is great. I mean, Henry Clay Folger and Henry Huntington would just go head to head Folger was one of Rockefeller's partners in Standard Oil and sort of had unlimited resources. And there was just a period of history where the wealth, this is what you would do, was acquire Shakespeare. Poor Huntington only got 4. Folger got 82.
Yes, please, in the middle here.
This is not a historical question, it's more of an interpretive question. What evidence do you find in the plays themselves that Shakespeare did not just want them to be seen, but wanted them to be studied, both individually and as a canon?
This question about the analysis of the works. And the question is, what evidence is there in the texts to suggest that Shakespeare wanted his plays not just to be performed, but also to be read and to be studied as individual works and as a complete canon of works?
It's tricky because there's a lot of debate about, since Shakespeare didn't go to the trouble of publishing his collected works himself the way Ben Jonson did he really care? You know, he died with half of his works unpublished. Others have argued that no, the Cordo publication clearly showed that Shakespeare was an active publishing author. I think the plays themselves, when you look at, you study, you come and you see productions of plays that you've seen many, many times, you always learn something new, you hear something new, and when you study them, the fact that you find things, the fact that when Romeo and Juliet have their first scene together, the first lines they speak, he speaks 4 lines to her, she speaks 4 lines to him. They speak 4 lines in which he has 2 and she has 2. And then he speaks a line, she speaks a line that rhymes with it, and they kiss. They've just formed a sonnet. A 14-line, very regular poem. And what's he doing? He's making this separate individual and this separate individual come together within 14 lines. Now, every one of us can go to the theater and say, wow, that was a really good love at first sight scene. Does anyone in the audience say, oh, they're speaking a sonnet? No, you don't. It's at a subtextual level. That is just, that's put there because I'm going to make a very effective love scene, and if you study it, you can find out why. I have a PhD student who used to be a tenured professor of paleontology in the Cal State system, gave it all up to come pursue a PhD in Shakespeare. And he's a very analytical mind. And he would come to me and say things like, what's Romeo and Juliet about? I'd say about 2 hours. He had no patience for me. He goes, no. It's about men and women, right? I said, okay, it's about men and women. Have you noticed that in the first scene of Romeo and Juliet, every word either starts with an M or a W? I said, no, that's not true. Take the wall of any manor made of Montague. And I mean, it's that kind of thing that you can do with Shakespeare when you keep finding new things there that suggests to me. And I think, Shakespeare was clearly embedding his work with various levels of meaning, that it could appeal to all sorts of people in his audience. Those standing in the yard who just wanted the dirty jokes, and the ones who had more ethereal appreciations, audiences of the Inns of Court, the lawyers. I compare it to, do you remember the old Rocky and Bullwinkle cartoons? They seem to me to be the ones that they could appeal to children watching them and to adults who were, cooking dinner while it was on. You just have jokes like Sir Isaac Newton and his cousin Fig. So I think he knew he was loading every rift with ore, and the fact that whether he intended his works to be published and more broadly available, or if his fellow actors just realized that, boy, this guy's got something, we better make sure that these plays don't vanish.
Person on the aisle.
Of all the plays, which one is your favorite and why?
question is for Eric. Of all the plays, which is your favorite and why?
I really love Measure for Measure. I love Measure for Measure because it's about sexual harassment. And we always say that, you know, Shakespeare is for all time and he's eternal, and that, you know, we dispense these platitudes. But if you can really point to something that we consider a contemporary hot button issue, and you've got this scene in which Isabella is pleading for her brother's life, and Angelo is saying, tell you what, you sleep with me and I'll let him go. And she says, I'm going to proclaim you, I'll tell everyone who you are. And he says, who would believe you? You're a woman. I'm a person of power. You know, 400 years before Clarence Thomas and Anita Hill. And that, for me, is what Shakespeare is about. He's about what we're about. And, you know, Shakespeare is writing during a period in which basically through the medieval period, all marriages were arranged, and the Puritans were arguing that no, marriages ought to be companion, affectionate. And so you have these plays which are, you know, which are really about the old patriarchy chuffing against the new order of young lovers who want to be in love with who they choose. And for us, that seems very modern. We're all about companionate marriages, and we will say that certain societies in which marriages are still arranged, well, that's kind of medieval. And so one of the interesting things about the study of the period is that it used to be called the Renaissance. The Renaissance is looking back to the classical time. It's a rebirth of classical ideals and literature and art and so forth. Many people now call it the early modern period, is that this is the beginning of what it means to be us and what it means to be modern. And I quite like that, and that's why Measure for Measure.
The very last row.
I know there were some major differences between the texts in the quartos and the First Folio. My question is, are there similar differences in the plays as they go from the First Folio to the fourth? And if there are, where do you think they came from?
This is a question about variants. There are variants between the quarto texts of certain plays and the folio text of the plays. And the question is, are there also variants between the First Folio, Second Folio, Third Folio, and the Fourth Folio of the 17th century?
The folios were page-for-page reprints of the previous one. So there's very little room for new material to come in, and there's almost nothing. They make corrections. In the Second Folio, I think they make 1,200 corrections of typographic errors, and the third, I believe there's 700, and the fourth, I believe there are 900 further. So over the course of the century, they're sort of further perfecting, and sometimes they're miscorrecting. There was something that whoever did it misunderstood. But those are all fairly minor. The differences between the quarto version, the quartos often, I'm generalizing, but the quartos were often printed right from Shakespeare's original foul paper manuscript. And the folios were often printed from the text of the play that they used in the theater. And so the folios are texts are almost always shorter. Clearly, the company streamlined the plays. So the folio text of Hamlet is about 300 lines or so shorter, as is the folio text of King Lear. And this actually creates a great deal of difficulty. Jonathan Bate and I edited the folio texts and so they're the more streamlined versions. And there was a great hue and cry because editors had always presented the quarto text. You know, the more Shakespeare, the better. But from our point of view, do you really want that original draft, or do you want the play? It's a lot like on a DVD. You know, the DVDs often come with the director's cut. You ever notice the director's cut is always longer? And those of us, I mean, you watch the director's cut if you're really invested in that director or in that filmmaker. By and large, we want the one that was edited for us. The entertainment value was better. And the analogy I like to use is that suppose I write a story and send it to the New Yorker, and the New Yorker writes back and says, great, we'd love to publish your story. Here's a check for $15,000. Would you mind cutting the 4th paragraph? Hell yes, I'll cut the 4th paragraph. My purpose is to be published in the New Yorker. My purpose is not to cling tenaciously to that paragraph. I think Shakespeare's the same way. The scene, the long soliloquy, "How all occasions do inform against me," only appears in the quarto version of Hamlet. It's a long soliloquy in a 4,000-line play. One will bet anything that Shakespeare's company said, "Bill, we're losing the audience now. Can we take this out?" And editors have long suggested, well, Shakespeare had this cut forced upon him by the theater. I think we have to include the theater in the collaborative process. Shakespeare probably said, "Yeah, you're right. Sorry," and they took it out. But it's a really interesting philosophical question that editors face, whether you want the authorial text, for lack of a better word, or the theatrical one. But the folios themselves are pretty much just reprints of each other, except for the 3rd folio, of course, in which they included a number of plays that were excluded. Plays like Pericles finally enters the canon in the 3rd folio and the 4th folio.
I'm sorry, I've received the sign that we have to wrap things up so that this theater can become a theater again. I want to end by saying I feel personally much better this morning knowing that as one copy arrives in Stratford with a police escort, one, I pray, left Rome with a papal blessing. Surely it's not cursed. And more importantly, I feel very grateful for this fascinating session, and please join me in thanking Eric Rasmussen.